What is the most minimal 1x optic in the game? It's probably the thing that you care about the most when choosing a 1x optic, is you want as clear of a sight picture, as unobstructed of a sight picture. At least that's a question that I've asked myself, and maybe it's a question you've asked yourself. So I set out to find which 1x optic was the least obstructed, which one gives you the best view of your target. Now there are 3 1x optic choices as primary optics in the game: the Miniflex, the RMR, and the OSA 7. And if you had asked me before I did the testing which one I thought was the most minimalist, which one gave you the most unobstructed view, I would have said the OSA 7. It just feels like it's the most unobstructed, but as it turns out, it actually has more screen coverage, what I'm calling it, things, including the scope and your gun and your character's arms, anything that can block your view of the world and potentially obscure a target. It actually has slightly more screen coverage than the Miniflex and the RMR for that matter. Both of those, the RMR and the Miniflex, have slightly less screen coverage. However, the OSA 7 does have a larger window size, which means that it has a better ratio of window size to screen coverage, which I think explains why it feels so much less obscured. The ratio of how much screen it takes up versus how big the window is on the optic is the best for the OSA 7. However, there are some caveats there. Obviously, if you're pairing the OSA 7 with a laser, particularly on any weapon that mounts the laser to the top rail, the laser will intrude into your sight picture potentially quite significantly, which diminishes that advantage that it has. But as it turns out, those 3 optics are far from the only 1x options that you have at your disposal in this game. And as it turns out, there are actually significantly better options, despite the fact that they are going to be slightly more expensive. So those 3 optics only cost 10 attachment points each. There are some other 1x optics that will cost 20 to 25 points, but actually end up being quite a bit better. So particularly in the optic accessory slot, you have access to the canted reflex, which is pretty garbage, admittedly. Both personally, I think so, and also the statistics back it up. It covers a lot of the screen. The window size is not very good, so the ratio of window size to screen coverage is not very good. I wouldn't mess around with the canted reflex. It's very cinematically pleasing, but in practical sense, it doesn't really work out all that well. But there are piggyback red dots that you get as an option on particular magnified optics. Not every single magnified optic has the option to mount a piggyback red dot, but some of them do. As of right now, 5 of them do. And as it turns out, these piggyback red dots are quite good, actually better than the standard 1x optics that you can just have as your primary optic. Particularly the Baker piggyback red dot and the ST Prism piggyback red dot. Those names being the magnified optic that they go on. Both of those have a significantly more minimal amount of screen coverage as compared to any of the standalone 1x optics that you can have in the primary optic slot. However, they do have a slightly smaller window size, so the ratio of window size to screen coverage is relatively similar. Arguably, they don't have too much of an advantage in that sense, but still, they do take up substantially less of your screen when aiming with either of those options, which means that's potentially more targets that you'll be able to see while you're aiming with those options. However, what I consider to be the best 1x red dot in the game is the SFG2. That one that's a magnified optic. It has a piggyback red dot, and it is very good. The screen coverage is a little bit more than those other 2 that I mentioned before, but it is still less than any of the 3 primary 1x optics that you can get on your weapon. And it has a larger window size than any of those 3, bigger than even the OSA 7, which means that the ratio of the window size to screen coverage is substantially better for this particular optic setup. I would highly recommend using this configuration of the SFG2 magnified optic with the piggyback red dot, even if you have absolutely no intention of using the magnified optic at all. Even if you just plan to use the 1x, I highly recommend using this. Yes, it's more expensive. You have to spend 20 points instead of 10, but if you have the points to spare, then you might as well. Honestly, it is a genuinely better aiming experience than the regular 1x red dots in the game. And you don't have to worry really at all about the laser or anything obscuring your view because the optic is mounted so high. Now you would think, because Battlefield 6 operates under the principle that the bullets actually come out of the barrel rather than out of the center of your view, like other games like Call of Duty and Apex and Rainbow Six Siege and those types of games. It's pretty common for the bullets in a first-person shooter to come out of your eyeballs, basically. But in Battlefield 6, they actually come out of the barrel of your gun, which means that in certain situations, the target that you're aiming at and that you have a view of cannot be hit from your position. You can do this yourself in the firing range by just crouching and trying to shoot the tops of the targets as you get close to the bench. You would think that having a higher bore offset, or whatever it's called, with a taller optic would exasperate this issue, but from my testing, it really makes a negligible difference. I think there is a slight difference. You will find that there is a slightly, ever so slightly bigger degree of offset, obviously, between your reticle and the barrel of the gun, but it makes a very minimal difference from what I can tell. I'm honestly a little skeptical that Battlefield 6 is using a true bullets coming out of the barrel system. I feel like there's something going on behind the scenes that it kind of averages the distance between your view and the barrel so that it's not 100% coming out of the barrel, because it honestly, the number of times where that will come into play where you're head glitching over some cover it's pretty infrequent. At least it seems a lot more infrequent than in other games where that system is used, in my opinion anyway. But you can ignore that potential downside, in my opinion, because it just doesn't come into play really ever. So yeah, that would be my recommendation if you're going to run a red dot. It's the SFG2 Prism sight or whatever, and then use the piggyback red dot on that. However, there are even more 1x options. You have LPVOs. The LPVOs in the game have 1x, a true 1x view, and as it turns out, these are actually quite compelling as well. Now, they are not nearly as minimalist, so if you want pure minimalism, I would 100% recommend the SFG2 piggyback red dot. These LPVOs will take up a bit more screen space, but they make up for that with absolutely massive windows, optic windows, which means that you'll be able to see more targets in the window itself rather than outside the window. And you have to worry significantly less about targets potentially being obscured right next to where you're aiming, very close to where you're aiming. I feel like it makes small adjustments in your aim slightly easier because the target isn't weaving in and out of the sight posts of your optic, right? But yeah, these LPVOs have significantly more, well, not significantly more, just barely more screen coverage, but they have a significantly bigger window size, which means the ratio of window size to screen coverage is massively bigger on the LPVOs, in the order of 6 times bigger ratio. The other thing about LPVOs is that they are extremely consistent. In case you didn't know, when you change magnification on the LPVOs, the size of the optic and the gun in your hands and everything, that doesn't change. Only the external world, the world around you, will change zoom and everything, which means that when you aim with LPVOs, you will have the exact same sight picture every time, no matter what. Another benefit of LPVOs that these other optics don't have is that when you aim with an LPVO, the front of your gun, the handguard, the front sight, any laser that you put on the gun, any barrel or muzzle attachment that you might be able to see normally, is completely gone. It's as if they don't exist at all. It just completely erases them. So again, LPVOs really provide a very, very consistent aiming experience. Every time you aim, it's going to look exactly the same, no matter what gun you're putting it on, no matter your weapon configuration or anything like that. It's always going to look exactly the same. So if you care a bit more about consistency, you want the aiming experience to be the exact same every time, especially between weapons, because some weapons have slightly different profiles and everything, then I would recommend the LPVOs. I will say the new LPVO that they just added, the SU-230, which is based on the Elcan Spectre DR. It has this really aggressive tint that isn't there on the real optic. I really hope they get rid of that. I don't know why they did that. But as of right now, that is a bit annoying and it could potentially throw you off. So I could see people not choosing that optic just because they aren't a particular fan of that. But statistically speaking, the new SU230 LPVO is statistically quite good. It has a very, very large window, and it has a very, very good ratio of window size to screen coverage. So if that's all you care about, those statistics of how good is the picture, then it's worth considering. But yeah, that tint is pretty hard to get past. I would say there's also something to be said about the fact that because it's only 1x or 4x, whereas the other LPVOs have multiple magnifications that you have to toggle through, it is a bit nicer to use that one at times, I find, the SU230, just because it's so simple. You have higher magnification and lower magnification. But again, this video is mainly focused on the 1x performance, so we're not really factoring in what it's like to have that extra ability to magnify. Again, I would recommend using an LPVO even if you have absolutely no intention of using any of the other magnification levels. They still make very good 1x's. The more unfortunate aspect is that they are expensive. For whatever reason, the new SU230 LPVO only costs 20 points, whereas the other LPVOs usually cost 25. My guess is they did that because it only has the 2 levels of magnification, where the other LPVOs have like 5 levels of magnification. So I guess the slightly greater variability of the other LPVOs makes them more expensive. But again, in my opinion, that isn't really all that worth it or anything. Yeah, the SU230 is a little cheaper than the other LPVOs. The other LPVOs being 25 points does make them pretty expensive. I find that is, it's 25% of your overall attachment budget, but who knows, it could be well worth it for you. Like I said, the LPVOs are very consistent. So again, just to reiterate, my recommendations: if you are going to run one of the standard 1x red dots in the primary optic category, I would recommend the OSA 7 if you're not running a top-mounted laser. If you are running a top-mounted laser, then I would recommend the Mini Flex. If you want an even better 1x performance and you are willing to spend 20 points instead of 10, then I would recommend the SFG2 with the piggyback red dot. And then if you want to run an LPVO, personally, I really like the NGFC LPVO, but the new SU230, if you have it unlocked, is also quite good if you can get past the tint. Personally, I really hate the tint, so it's hard for me to fully recommend that one, but it is still a very good optic. Again, statistically, it has a huge window and everything. So anyway, if you were wondering statistically which 1x optic is the best, those would be my recommendations. But I really highly recommend you try all of the optics for yourself and decide for yourself which one you end up liking, because you never know, right? It's all, optic really comes down to personal preference a lot of the time. What the reticle looks like, and exactly like the shape and the size of the window can have a big impact on how you feel you perform with a particular optic. I feel like the optics I choose a lot of the times are not the ones that are statistically the best, but are just the ones that I prefer to use and feel like I do the best with. So do with this information as you will, but there you have it. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you later.